Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special and exciting guest, Harriet Sergeant, who is a fellow of the Centre for Policy Studies. But more important than that, she's just this incredible woman who I've been trying to get on my podcast for a really long time. And I've just explained to Harriet what it's all about. I'm saying the aim is like, if you're listening to Radio 4, and instead of getting the usual turgid leftist shite, you actually got an interesting conversation between two people. So that's the idea, Harriet. So, and we're good to go. I've admired you from afar for a long time. I read lots of your stuff. Now, first of all, you did a really, really interesting book, didn't you? Where you spent time, you befriended a Sarf London street gang.
Yes, I was actually doing a report for the Centre for Policy Studies on why Black Caribbean and white working class boys fail. So I was travelling all over the country, Newcastle, Margate, Brixton, interviews these boys, who most of whom, in fact, all of whom turned out to be criminals. And I became very friendly, simply, I think, because they were close with this gang in Brixton, who I had someone with me who was coming round. He was actually... He was a former armed robber I met at some community centre. He said, you cannot wander around Brixton picking up teenage boys. This is not a good idea. So he came round with me and he mentioned this gang of boys who collected outside his local chicken takeaway. So off we went. And I remember vividly standing on the other side of the road. And there was these group of boys who were, frankly, to a white, middle-class, middle-aged woman like me, terrifying. I mean, usually when I see a group of boys like that, all I want to do is walk on by and hope not to draw attention to myself. Yeah. I mean, they were shouting, they were swearing, they were cadging cigarettes off passers-by. They were really frightening. Anyway, this young man said to me, come on, these are exactly the people that you need to interview. So I thought, oh my God. Anyway, over the road. And I went and started talking to them. And the first thing surprised me was that they were very interesting. They had lots to say I was asking them about why they weren't at school, all this kind of thing. They were also very perceptive. I had a lot of difficulty understanding them. It took me a bit of time. The man with me had to kind of translate on some to explain what they were saying. Unfortunately, the episode didn't end well because the gang leader, who was called Tuggy Tug, who was he was the smallest but very charismatic, he took the man aside and said, why don't we bang her and steal my watch? But luckily, I didn't know about that until much later. So anyway, about 4 or 5 months went past. I'd gone on interviewing and I wanted to go back and talk to them about their criminality because so many of the boys I'd interviewed were up to crime. So I went back and they were thrilled to see me. I was surprised. I didn't think they'd remember me. They ran up the road waving their arms and screaming. And so I started asking them about their crime. And they were saying stuff like, oh, yeah, we do the shooting and the stabbing. So I thought, though, that they looked quite kind of, at that time they were about 15, they looked quite peaky. And my son was then that age. And so I think I was tuned into the teenage boy who, as we know, is a race apart from the rest of us. And I said, are you hungry? And they immediately changed. And they said, we're always hungry. So I was enraged by this. None of them seemed to have... 2 of them were in care and living in some kind of hostel. Another had a mother who gave them a Mars bar or a Twix now and again. So anyway, I took 4 of them because I could only fit 4 in my car to Nando's.
I was going to say it had to be Nando's.
To be Nando's. Which was great. I spent a lot of time in. I got very fond of Nando's. Anyway, and I was very touched by them. They immediately wanted to tell me about themselves. They were very open about what they were doing. And they also, which surprised me, they had naturally good manners. They felt I had done something for them. They wanted to do something for me. And I was really touched and surprised. So then I started taking them out to meals. I started taking them to museums, art galleries, in an effort to change their lives.
And how did they respond to the art galleries and the stuff?
Well, they didn't want to go at all. I mean, can you imagine teenage boys? I mean, it just shows, you think you have this romantic view of street life that's all very exciting and edgy, but actually having hung around with those boys, I can tell you street life is very boring. And so boring that anyone will understand who has a 15-year-old, 14-year-old son that they were willing to come with me to a museum or an art gallery.
Yeah.
And I remember I took them to the Tate Modern, and all they were interested in was how much the paintings cost.
Fair enough.
I was trying to tell them. They got very excited because they were really interested in money, because money meant independence, and they were desperate to be independent. And so I showed them all this money. And then, of course, in places like Tate Modern, there's always a lot of pretty young girls. So I said, oh, young girls come here. So then they got very excited, what with the cost of the paintings and the pretty young girls. So that was quite successful.
And do you think that they were improved by the art in any way, or was that a sort of...
No, because I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel at that time, I'm a journalist. I had no idea. I was just wanted to show them there was another world, so there was something else they could aspire to. And so I was trying to take them out, introduce them to people, just so they could feel there was another world for them out there. Because a lot of them had barely been out, not just out of Brixton, but it's so dangerous for them. They'd barely been out of their block, their estate.
Why is it dangerous for them?
Well, because boys from other estates. So we sort of wander quite happily around the place with no problems. But for them, it's like one of those, one of those war games they're playing. And it's just very dangerous. I mean, they get stabbed, they get shot, they whatever. I do remember at one point asking them how many of their friends had been killed. They were 15 at this point.
Yeah.
And I think we counted off 5. And I said, well, actually, can you prove that to me? Or were they just giving this number?
Yeah.
So then they got out their phones and they showed me articles in the South London
Press,
yes,
whatever it is,
and there were the stories.
Did you form a view on how are they rescuable? I mean, what are we doing wrong?
I think they are, and I don't think we nearly start young enough. I think that if we started in primary school, the big problem is when they move into secondary school. Yeah. And when I did my report, you see, I was interviewing I was befriending them because it went past that. This is now about, I suppose I've known them now for about 7 or 8 years. Or longer actually. Anyway, so I was interviewing them and writing my report. So they would tell me things, and then I'd go and look at the research and find that it was exactly true. And for instance, all the boys, not those boys, but they all mainly dropped out of school around about the age of 14, which is the age when they do drop out. And it was mainly because of literacy problems.
Right.
And our primary schools have certainly got better, but they are still failing to teach mainly boys how to read and write. And if you fail to teach someone how to read and write, that is a one-way ticket to the edge of society.
Yep. Yeah.
I would like to take some of those primary school teachers, and I'd like to take them to a young offenders institute or a prison, so they could see where the boys that they fail end up in really literally 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. This is one of my pet subjects, actually, because it seems to me that there is one very clear and proven way to teach children to read, and that is the phonics method.
Which works. I mean, I don't know if you've looked at the...
I taught my children to read from
Yeah.
scratch using a book called Superphonics.
Yeah.
And if I can do it, anyone can do it. And it's weird. I was the other day I was talking to a woman who trains teachers at a college in South London, and we got into an argument about phonics. She said, well, it doesn't work for everyone. And I said, well, it does. It just works. She said, oh no, certain children from certain ethnic communities and stuff. And I'm thinking, why? What's the special rule that stops this system?
No, it works particularly well with boys from poor backgrounds. That is the key thing. And there was that great study in Clackmannanshire where they were so amazed by the results, because the boys, usually, girls outdo boys with reading, but using the phonic method, the boys actually outstripped the girls by such a large amount that, the person taking the survey actually went back and checked the results 2 or 3 times because she was so staggered. So, because unfortunately, and you see this time and time again with these young men, they are let down by sort of leftist ideology that grips our schools. First of all, that the reading method. They are not given the reading method that has been proved by large-scale survey of research to most benefit them.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that makes me very angry. The other thing, and I was very fortunate because my son, who was the same age as these boys, was very lucky. He managed to get into St Paul's, which is a great,
not a bad school. Yes.
Great school. But the thing, and I then went and interviewed a number of headmasters because I became so fascinated by this when I was doing my research. Who actually succeeds with young men? Who is very good with young men? I mean, the army's one of them, the cadets, and public schools, because they understand young men and they give them what they need, which is a lot of activity, the chance to work in a group, to prove themselves through competitive sport, which is the main one, or they offer a lot of extracurricular stuff like music, theatre, which I understand that can't happen, but they in state schools, but they could certainly have the competitive sport. I mean, private schools have how many hours of sport a day,
and
weekend stuff.
Another ingredient, they give them lots and lots of food, lots and lots of food. Do you know that at Eton they have this? Between breakfast and lunch, they have this thing called chambers, where they go to their houses and they get given these little sort of cheese on toast or prepared by the in-house chef, and then they have another tea in the afternoon. They understand.
Well, they need a lot of activity.
Feed boys.
Yeah, they need a lot of activity. And the thing about gangs, very quickly you understand that gangs are simply giving themselves filling out the vacuum. The school has not given them what they need to thrive. And what they need is hierarchy and activity and competition. And there's nothing more hierarchical, active, or full of or competitive than a London gang. And if we gave that to boys very early, because these boys, the other thing about these boys, they mature early. So if we gave those to boys, I don't know, from the age of 7, 8, 9, in primary school, so hook them in, I think that would do a huge amount to help them.
I'm totally with you. Can I ask you, did you get much fire support from the lefty press when you were doing all this stuff? Were they sympathetic to you?
Well, I got a kind of, I appeared with people like Owen Jones and I got a kind of, I don't know, I got a kind of grudging respect because I knew what I was talking about.
Yes, but I bet it was grudging.
But for instance, I was on Start the Week with Ken Loach, who was incandescent. He said I'd made up everything the boys had said. Well, honestly,
I love
as
that.
it was all in there, the way they speak. If I could make up like that, I would be the world's most brilliant speechwriter. I would be writing script writer. I would be, writing scripts now. But he couldn't bear it because they were saying, look, we don't want the welfare state. We don't want another social worker. We just want a social worker's wage. They were fed up with the job centres, with probation staff, all of whom do nothing for them. Schools, I mean, they are 100% reliant on the welfare state,
Yeah.
and they hate it.
Yes.
I would have to bribe them to take them into a job centre.
Yeah. I was thinking about Ken Loach's response. The left really don't like it when anyone from the right treads on their patch. They think poor people, black people, it's their domain.
Yes, they don't like that.
They really
But
don't.
I must say, apart from him, on
Yeah.
the whole, I got on pretty well with.
You did
everyone.
some good. Can I just, before we move on from this section, I've got to tell you my gang story, because I was on holiday in California when the LA riots broke out, and I got called up by my newspaper's foreign desk to go and cover them. And so I went over to, I think it was Hollywood Boulevard,
Yeah.
and the National Guard were all lining up on the street. So there were no white people around because it was quite dangerous, and there were
Yeah.
shops on fire and stuff. And I was wandering along, and I'd done a bit of vox pop with various people hiding in cafes, and I was ready to go home. And I was wandering past this shoe shop, and outside were these about 5 or 6 young men, blacks and Latinos. And I said to them, they were young. I said, "What? So what are you doing here?" And they said, "Oh, we're waiting to loot this store. We're waiting for some brothers to come along, and then we're going to just take the store." And I said, "Oh, I see." And they said, "Do you want anything?" Pointing to the, and I said, "Well, I'm not. I wear Doc Martens, and I don't think you have Doc Martens in America, do you?" And they said, "Yeah, sure, there's some."
Yeah.
And I said, so who are you exactly? And they said, "Oh, we're the 4 Tray Crips." And I said, "Well, what's 4 Tray?" They said, 43, 4 Tray, we're the Crips. And I said, "Oh, I like the Crips and the Bloods."
Yeah.
And of course they were.
Yeah.
So we had this similar conversation where, rather like you had, I imagine, they were sort of so taken aback by this sort of alien creature entering their world, and they could have mugged me or whatever, or I could have been their friend.
Yeah.
But it was
Well,
was
I
an
think
experience.
they just like someone, and I remember because when we had the riots here, they were all out there. They were all phoning me.
Your boys?
Yes, they were all phoning me, and one of them was complaining. He was just actually going into a shop to loot it. And so, I was telling him, "No, you mustn't do that, blah, blah, blah." But then he phoned me back a bit later, and he was really upset because he'd looted a computer, and then someone had stolen it from him. And he was really
there is no honour
distressed.
among thieves, is there? Right. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my and let me say, totally fascinating guest, Harriet Sergeant. More in a moment.
Hey folks, I want to tell you about Breitbart News' Second Amendment newsletter, Downrange with A.W.R. Hawkins. Features the top gun stories of the week, every week, and guest columnists like Gun Owners of America's Larry Pratt or Armed American Radio's Mark Walters. Also features a review of a firearm or a firearm accessory each week. The newsletter downloads on Thursday, comes right to your email inbox. You can subscribe at breitbart.com/AWR.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Harriet Sergeant, who's, by the way, laid up in bed with her wounded foot, and I'm sitting here eating cake. I just had some lemon tart, which is rather good. We were lamenting the fact in the interval that we're right wing, we're conservative, aren't we? But we're so nice, and yet we get so much grief for our politics from so many people.
Yes, I mean, I just, what I find sad is that everybody has now got into their little armed encampment of their beliefs, and I've always liked having, I have friends. I know one man I like very much who runs a squat. I have my gang who turn up here when they're not in prison. I mean, I hope to have friends, or I try and have friends from every different background. And political class, because I think it's really important. I'm curious. I want to find out what's going on, and I want to know what the truth is. And if the truth is uncomfortable, if it makes the Tories look bad, I don't care. I just want to know what is the truth.
I'd quite like to make the Tories look bad right now because they're not really very Tory-ish. But then that's cheaty subject.
But I think it's very sad that people now will only choose their friends, and it's got so difficult. You've got some people who are only have some people who are only socialise with Remainers. I've had a number of people who do that. I went to a party the other day. And they told me, there's Brexiteers in one room and Remainers in the other. So of course I went straight into the Remainer room. I know the party whereof
you speak because I was at the same party. You live in London, for goodness sake. Almost everyone is a Remainer in this country, and it's very hard. Yes,
I get a bit tired with being told that I'm fat, old, ugly and stupid, which are all the things. None
of which you are. No, exactly.
Which are all the things that, and I say, well, yes, but then all the young people that I interviewed for my various reports. I did a report on young people in care. I did these boys. They all voted Brexit. The poor vote Brexit because they come through our school system, which lets them down, is improving, but it doesn't do it well enough job. And then they come up against semi-literate, hardly able to make themselves understood. They then come up against the well-educated Eastern European migrants who have a very good education system.
Because they haven't... My brother is a very successful tech entrepreneur. Where is he recruiting his tech talent? Not, I'm afraid, in the UK. He's outsourced it to Cluj in Romania, which happens to have two of the best tech universities in Europe. And guess what? They're not talking about social justice. They're not having safe spaces. They're not worrying about cisgendered people versus whatever the fashionable terminology is. They're interested in learning stuff. How are we going to compete with...
Well, also the other thing that makes me so angry in this country, once again, we're having another great hoo-ha about university education. Actually, we should not be discussing university education. We should be discussing technical colleges and the lack of them.
Yes.
And how we train the young men that, at the moment, come up, aren't taught to read and write, and go straight from school onto the street, and by the time they're 18 have probably in prison, or on benefits, or both. Those are the young men that we need to be grabbing hold of and educating. And what is virtuous? Because Remainers go on and on about their virtue. What is virtue about sort of warehousing, sidelining and warehousing these young men from poor backgrounds and replacing them with, admittedly, much better educated, well-trained Eastern Europeans? I cannot understand. No. I really can't.
And if you were an employer in virtually any sphere, and you had a choice between somebody who'd done gender studies at a proper uni, or, I don't know, electrical engineering at a City and Guilds college, course, whatever they're called, which one would you go for?
Well, obviously, I'd go for that. But above all, I'd probably go for an Eastern European. Because, they have very good technical training. And it's not, Remainers seem to think that Eastern Europeans kind of spring from their mother's womb as sort of nice with work ethic and everything else and well-trained.
Yeah.
No, it's because their schools turn them out like that. And we should be asking why our schools can't turn our children out like that too.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think partly it's the fact that these people know what communism looks like, and they don't want it anymore. They want a future in the world. They want to grab a piece of it, and they're hungry for that. In the same way, actually, that you see in schools in places like, I've been to lots of African schools. And the kids are really, really eager to learn in their enormous classrooms they haven't got incredible teaching aids or anything. They want to learn because it's their route out of poverty.
Yeah.
Whereas here we've kind of been pampered by the welfare state and so on to a degree.
No, I don't agree. I think that there is, all those boys I have become friendly with were right at the bottom of the ladder. You really couldn't get lower than them. And they were hungry. They were desperately keen to make their way in the world.
Yep.
And to be independent and to be successful. Unfortunately, they had only one kind of template of success given to them, which was drug dealing. But they put all their energy, and they were incredibly brave, and they gave it a lot of thought. And if one could just have taken that aspiration and that energy and channeled it in a different way, and in a way that they saw they could succeed, they would have done it.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
They weren't sitting around, and they would never, ever take benefits. They thought taking benefits was the sign of a loser. They refused point blank to come into the job centre because if anyone saw them in that job centre, they would think they were a waste man.
A waste man.
A waste man, because it meant they couldn't earn enough money any other way, robbing or doing drugs. I mean, they had very strong morals. But it's just that they weren't our morals.
Are you saying that they actually went to the polling station to vote for in the
Not them. No, they didn't vote, but other people, older ones I know.
You're talking
did.
about people, okay, in the inner cities
you see,
and in the north.
I mean, also it's when they say that the Remainers seem to get in their head, they think it's just white working class, but it isn't. It's often children of immigrants, Caribbean children, Asian children. They're all the ones that are up against, if you go and interview them, they're all up against Eastern Europeans.
Can we move on to another subject that you've been writing about recently, which is pretty hot right now, which is the whole foreign aid debate? Because we've just had a series of scandals blowing up, haven't we, about different charities, led by Oxfam, where we've got the story about the head of operations in Haiti in the earthquake after 2010, I think.
Yes.
And local girls were being lined up in Oxfam T-shirts to serve as
That's right, and having sort of orgies, Caligula-like orgies, as one worker described it. And these poor little things who were, pretty young, certainly beneath the age of consent in Haiti is 18, and they were all younger than that, running around naked except for Oxfam T-shirts. And there's simply... But it's too easy to dismiss this as one bad apple. I mean, this obviously, I'm afraid, is throughout the aid industry and not just confined to Oxfam. And more stories are coming out that's revealing there's one particularly awful story by a man who worked in the UN for quite some time, saying that that paedophiles have now rushed into the aid industry, and in fact the Criminal Intelligence Service warned that paedophiles from 1999, that paedophiles who no longer were welcomed in the Catholic Church or in public schools were going to into aid agencies because it gave them such a complete...
Because there's no scrutiny,
There's no scrutiny. You've got on some T-shirt from whoever it is. The government's pretty non-existent. It's chaotic. There's lots of orphan children wandering around. People are desperate. And to me, this is what really sickens me in all of this, is the abuse of people's desperation. I mean, we get all excited about the President's Club. Okay, so...
Well, not us, but some people get all excited about it.
It's not great. It was not a great thing. But still, the girls who were serving in the President's Club had chosen to do so. And the point is, if they said no, they were not going to starve, and their families were not going to starve. Whereas the young girl who was interviewed in Haiti, who was this man in Oxfam, one of his girls, she said yes, because he gave me milk powder for my baby.
Yeah. I was talking to a mutual friend of ours, Johnny Foreman, about this.
Yes, he wrote I quoted him in my article. He wrote an excellent... I've read it. It's very good.
He's written one of the definitive books, hasn't he, on the problem with aid,
yes,
and the corruption it brings. And he, one example he gave actually to me the other day was he said the first thing they do is they go and hire an interpreter on $100 a day. Normally, that interpreter or driver, whoever, is the local doctor or somebody like that. So somebody that the community badly needs for other things, i.e. being a doctor.
All the professionals go and work for the aid agency.
The economy is completely inflated by you get some wage inflation because of this ridiculous $100 a day rate. And so they completely screw things up. Anyway, but the other point he made about if one wanted to take the sort of broad-minded line, one could say, well, of course, people working abroad, why shouldn't they hire prostitutes? The point he made was, this is not people going to the flesh pots of Nairobi for some well-earned R&R. This is people on the front line where people are absolutely desperate, will do anything, and they are exploiting them. It is
yes,
it's
and
monstrous.
also, I read an absolutely fascinating report from Save the Children. In
the 2008 one.
In Liberia.
Yeah.
And it was looking at one small town where the kind of aid circus had come to town.
Yeah.
And what happened. Now, this small town had not had much prostitution. Obviously a bit, but not much. And it never had child prostitution. And it interviewed, and it's so rarely, you always hear the aid industries, the people working in it, the aid workers. You don't actually hear the voices of the people who are meant to be helped. So that's why I found this report so riveting, because these people, the parents described heartbreaking how they saw their little daughters from the age of 10 going off with NGOs, how they didn't have the power to stop their daughters, they didn't dare complain about these people, and how they were really reliant on these NGOs for food. So they couldn't say no, and they couldn't stop their children being prostituted. It's hard. It's really well worth reading.
That is very interesting, and of course the icing on the cherry on the cake is that these organisations often preach to us about how we should behave and lecture the decadent West on the errors of our ways. Oxfam, for example, just in January this year, released a report blaming free markets for the plight of the third world. And what were they proposing? They were proposing higher taxes, more government regulation, the very things guaranteed to make life more miserable and poor in the developing world.
Yes, and anyway, it's been proved over and over again that free markets have raised millions out of poverty. The very excellent book by the Zambian economist Moyo.
Dambisa Moyo.
Yes, Dambisa Moyo.
I love that book.
Really, really good. And as she said, aid has never created a job. She's really, really against foreign aid. She said it's infantilized so many Africans. And I lived abroad for a long time, and one of those was I spent about a year in Africa and 7 years in Asia. And that was certainly, a lot of Africans complained about that. They resent the fact that their governments are simply taken over by aid agencies. The governments are getting 40% of their revenue from aid agencies. So what's their number one priority? It's not their voters. It's schmoozing the aid agencies.
And of course, if you've got foreign companies providing aid, that relieves these dictators of the obligation to look after their poor, because the Muzungus, idiots.
And to provide education, transport, health.
And of course, simultaneously, they are siphoning off a portion of that aid to go into to build statues to themselves, gold-plated statues or whatever, or solid gold statues. I think you quoted the figure. Dambisa Moyo says it's something like $1 trillion has been spent on aid for Africa since...
In 50 years.
In 50 years.
And what have we got? It's got worse.
It's got poorer.
And the countries, and she points out that the countries that have... that's right. She said Ghana and South Korea in 1957 had the same GDP. And, now it's hugely different, And South Korea had very little aid. And so aid has not solve the problem.
No. Whereas, and I think if you looked probably at where Hong Kong was in 1950, it certainly had a lower standard of living than GDP per capita than the UK.
Yeah.
And now, of course, they're significantly richer than us. And that wasn't because of aid.
No.
But I did wonder about this. Why Africa and not... Why is Asia generally not accepted this aid? Is it because Africans are considered more biddable, the sort of Mrs. Jellyby type thing, where because they're black and they live in Africa, they're somehow more benighted, or what is it that attracts these
Africa? I don't know that one. I don't know, but certainly, I always thought that colonialism was in order to allow middle class English people to live like the upper class abroad, you know. And I wonder whether sort of the aid industry has allowed NGOs to live a far better life.
There was a shift, wasn't there? You see, I'm a great fan of empire, and one is safe to say this on this podcast. I remember once going to I went on an overland trip through Africa in 1984 for my gap year, and I remember going to the market, and I think Omdurman in the Sudan, and I was going to look for a Sudanese dagger that I wanted. I don't know where it is now. And this old man, sort of 80-something, accosted me in the marketplace and said to me, "Why did you leave us? This country was so much better run than that when you were here," and he meant it.
Well, I think in the end, you know, countries are like people. In the end, you want to run yourself. You might decide you're probably much happier and better living at home with your parents, but you don't care. You want to get out there and you want to get on with your life and be independent. But the thing is that having all this money spent corrupting the government, coming between a government and its people, this has not produced help. This has not made any difference.
I wasn't sort of suggesting that we should bring back the empire. I suppose what I'm saying is that in the old days, the kind of young men who, after their public schools, did the civil service, did whatever exam it was necessary to become a district commissioner, they were quite principled. They were quite high-minded. They wanted to give their lives to service to help this country. I'm not sure that the same is true of the kind of people who go and work for these NGOs. We give them the benefit of the doubt, or we have given them the benefit of the doubt, that they're selfless and caring, but actually I think that has enabled them to get away with murder.
But also they're moving around. I mean, the district commissioner went and stayed in his district for a long time, whereas these NGOs are, you know, going from one exciting war-torn area to the other.
So disaster vultures,
yes.
Sort of going to the next
There's a
carrion.
great thread on Twitter from a woman who was the child of NGOs, and her description of being the child of NGOs and their... I mean, she was obviously quite bitter against them, so it wasn't totally balanced, but it was very insightful, absolutely fascinating.
Oh, that's right. No, I read that thread. I wish I could. Yes, she was basically confirming all our worst suspicions. She said, none of these revelations surprise me.
Yeah.
By the way, we've just got to briefly mention Brendan Cox. Brendan Cox, the widower of Joe Cox, who has been given a free pass by the BBC because obviously his wife was horribly murdered, and that's of course appalling. But he was exposed in this scandal because while he was working for...
Yes, well, I heard that. I always think I'm the most out-of-touch person, but even I heard that he'd done all kinds of really quite yucky stuff.
Well, he'd grabbed
but no one was allowed to say it.
No, because he worked for Save the Children, and this was his sort of get out of jail free. I have to say, people have messy personal lives, and I think as one gets older, one gets slightly more forgiving about people's foibles. I mean, it must have been pretty horrible being attacked by Brendan Cox or whatever, or being leapt on. But by the by, I would think it would be very sad if people's take-home message that was the problem with Brendan Cox was that he was a serial grope or whatever. Whereas it seems to me the real problem is that in the guise of healing the world, he's actually championed some very dubious causes.
Yeah.
Been very aggressive to people like on our side of the argument. I think that's where people's ire should be directed, not towards his kind of his
Well, it's
sexual
the
problems.
hypocrisy. I must say, I think this is a very good opportunity to take a long, hard look at our aid industry
Yes.
and see if it's really effective. I mean, I was actually one of the first people who wrote about Kids Company a long time ago, and simply I went down there while I was doing one of my reports and saw that there was no kid. The great problem about Kids Company, there were no kids there.
Yes, so Kids Company, because some American special friends, as they're known, in fact, there's only one person listens to this podcast, and he or she is called the special friend.
Yeah.
Anyway, if they are American, they may not realise the Kids Company was this charity run by this extraordinary woman in these colourful robes with a weird sort of Harry Potter type headband.
Yes.
Called Camilla Batman Jelly.
And yes, that's right. And she had David Cameron. She had all these pop stars.
Guys from the BBC. Yeah. Did Chris Martin of Coldplay gave gazillions, I think. Loads of people.
The BBC, because you had the what was he called? Was on her list of one of the trustees.
Yes.
So she
Alan Yentob.
So she had everyone behind her, because I knew a lot of the people who worked for her and also were using because of my connections.
Your boys, yeah.
So I sort of saw the other side, and I knew that it was some very dodgy stuff going on. But to actually come out with it, and I wrote about it. I wrote about going down there and finding no one in the charity. And one of the staff was very upset about what was going on. I mean, that was interesting. And he said, come back on Friday and see. So I went back on the Friday, and there were a lot more young people there. So I said, well, why are you here today? And they said, oh, because we get given money. And she was her staff were literally handing out brown envelopes of cash. And the kids themselves, the teenagers, complained to me about this. They thought it was quite wrong.
Did they really?
This is what I love.
These are your gang boys, they were saying.
It wasn't the gang, it was other people that I met there, and I interviewed them. And they said it was quite wrong. And they said, in the old days, if you had to do something, you had to show you'd learned something, or you had to clean up the place or whatever. Now, she said, you just go down and you get your envelope money. And she said some people get much more. Her favourites got a lot more, and the rest of us don't get so much. And of course, she was doing that so she could say she had the numbers coming in, because otherwise the numbers were just not there. So she was sort of manipulating her numbers. And when I remember walking out, and her great thing was these were kids who had no parents, no one was looking after them, blah-de-blah. I walked out and there was a line of cars queuing up, and there were adults driving the kids there. The kids jumped out, went in, picked up their envelope, got back in the car, waving the envelope, and drove off.
You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Harriet Sergeant.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
Let's take Barbara in Maryland.
Black History Month pees me off every year.
I promise you, I am not going to stick on old talking points. I am not going to stick on the things that everybody else always talks about. I'm going to give you real links to Black history so we can clear up all of that distortion, and maybe we can actually have that real discussion about keeping our history relevant.
Sonny's Corner, Saturday at 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125. This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Harriet Sergeant. Yeah, Harriet, do you not think that the third sector, as it's rather grandly known, the charities sector, is the last great can of worms that needs opening up? That so much bad stuff is happening underneath the surface.
I do think so. And I think actually we do have to look very clearly at charities. I mean, there are a lot of charities that are doing good work, but there are a lot of charities that aren't. And we seem to have absolutely no idea who's doing good work and who isn't. And I think we need to look very clearly. We've got to, for example, one of the things that can easily be done is actually just to drop round in a charity. And that's how I saw that Kids Company was not what it was claiming to be at all.
Yeah.
And you can just drop round and see if there's anybody actually using the charity. That's a big thing. And the other thing is actually talking to the people who are using the charity, not talking to them with the head of the charity standing there, but getting hold of them and, taking them off to have a chocolate brownie or hot chocolate in somewhere nearby, but somewhere outside the charity, and finding out if they find that charity really helpful, is really doing stuff for them. Nobody ever does that. I mean, it absolutely astounds me.
It's interesting what you were saying there, because on a larger scale, this also applies to the entirety of Britain's current foreign aid spending.
Well, exactly. It's a little bit more difficult, though. I would love to do that. It's a little bit more difficult dropping into charities in Ethiopia or wherever.
I've got a crazy friend who I met fox hunting. He is insane, as fox hunting people tend to be. He actually goes out to places like Mogadishu to vet how aid spending is.
Really?
Yes, but I don't think he's doing it for Difford. He's doing it for somebody else.
Yes.
But
that's very interesting.
I think, did you give the example in your piece or in the Spectator recently, or somebody did, about how among the Difford's aid, Department for International Development,
yes,
set up by a Labour government, just chuck cash at the third world, basically. Doesn't get any scrutiny. And as an example of this, the article cited a village in Pakistan.
Oh yes, that was me.
That was you.
Which
had been given a new school.
Yes.
But this guy had actually been to that village the week before.
He happened to have been there.
And there was no school. And we've also got stories about money this year going. This was a panorama story. Normally the BBC doesn't like to cover these stories because aid is good and it's a left-wing cause, therefore they don't scrutinise it. But they did, to their credit, cover the story of money going to groups in Syria affiliated to Al-Qaeda.
Oh, yes.
It's crazy. And this is David Cameron, do you remember him?
Yeah.
Useless Prime Minister, who ring-fenced our aid budget so that it's 0.7%
But it's a huge amount of money, and this money
13.5 billion a year, isn't it?
This money is sloshing around with no accountability, very little accountability, and all kinds of corrupting influences from it, which it's really shocking.
And it doesn't have to be this way. As I understand it, America is much better at scrutinising where its aid goes.
Yes.
They're much stricter about who it goes to, how well it's being used, and if it's not being used well. So it's not beyond the wit of man to. Another grumble I wanted to have, I don't know whether you've heard this. I was saying, look, where is the Charity Commission on all this? Why isn't the Charities Commission doing more to scrutinise these charities?
Well, they see the Charity Commission's had its money kind of cut by half.
Yes, but
and it's not got that number. I mean, there's a lot of charities and not that number of people to scrutinise them.
But isn't it also true that the civil servants at the Charities Commission are about as low grade as I've heard this, that they really are not?
They were pretty good when Camilla Batman-Gallagher and Kids Company, when all of that was coming out.
Were they?
Well, they were very. I mean, William Shawcross.
William Shawcross is great,
very good.
but I'm just worrying about the material he's got to work with. And if all your colleagues are all your juniors are just.
I don't know about that so much, but they were trying their best. But I think it is pretty hard to all these, like Ofsted. It's very hard to check. You've got a huge number of schools. How are you going to check them? But I actually think it's absolutely imperative. I mean, there's this report that's just come out today about the government department who checks aid spending.
Yeah. Who
said that an awful lot of it is short term, and is just making people dependent, not making them, set up their own thing and be independent. And I actually think that's the same with welfare as with aid. I mean, going back to my young men, they would have been so desperate for something that had a chunk of money that would have made them independent now.
Yeah.
Whereas all they get is these little dribbles of money to keep them dependent, which is our benefit state.
Yeah.
And I think that's very sad. I think we could well try and do something about that.
I think what we're saying here, by way of conclusion, because I've got to dash off to see Christopher Booker launch a report at the House of Lords, is the right-wing solution is always better than the left-wing solution. Harriet Sergeant, thank you very much. You listened to the Delingpole podcast with my very special guest, Harriet Sergeant, and wasn't she great? And see you soon.